Thank you. All right, so good morning. Welcome to my talk. Today we're going to be talking about what's in the blue bin, talking about repurposing malware. As was mentioned, I'm Patrick Wardle. I work at Jamf as a principal security researcher. So, as I mentioned, today we're going to be talking about repurposing other people's Mac malware. And we're going to talk about this to show how hackers can take existing malware samples and refigure them for their own surreptitious purposes. So we'll start by showing why this is a very appealing idea to hackers, and then explain exactly how they would go about repurposing existing samples. Of course, we'll also show then how these new samples can sidestep some of Apple's and third-party security mechanisms, even though the malware is essentially still the original samples. And then finally, we'll talk about, at the end of the talk, how we can detect even these repurposed or reconfigured samples through heuristics and behavioral-based detections. So let's dive in. So here's kind of a diagrammatic overview that conceptually explains the repurposing process. So imagine spy A, or agency A, or hacker A has developed some sophisticated, fully featured Mac malware and deployed it to various targets. Spy B, or hacker B, or agency B somehow captures this malware, either in transit or maybe pulls it off an infected system. Spy B then takes this captured malware into her lab and repurposes it. So what do we mean by repurposing? Well, we'll get into this more in the rest of the presentation, but essentially you can think of it as reconfiguring the malware, often at the binary level. So as we can see on the slide, once Spy B has captured this malware, in her lab, she's going to reconfigure this so that when she redeploys it to her own systems, the malware will now connect back to her command and control server so that then she can task these new targets. So if you're a hacker, let's talk about why this is actually a rather excellent idea. So first, there are incredibly well-funded, well-resourced, very mission-motivated hackers, APT groups, and three-letter agencies that are creating some actually very sophisticated, very elegant, fully featured Mac malware that they have successfully deployed and tested both locally and in the wild. So the idea is, why not let these groups, these agencies with a lot of time, resources, and money, create these complex malware samples, and then, again, if you're a hacker, just repurpose it for your own missions, your own cyber espionage operations. The idea is really let those with more time and resources do all the hard work, and then you kind of piggyback off that. Second, another benefit of this approach for a hacker is if your repurposed or recycled malware gets detected, it's likely going to be misattributed back to the original creators. Right? It's unlikely to be detected that it's been a modified sample. So again, as a hacker, it's always good if somebody else gets blamed for your own actions. Now, we're actually going to see in this slide that advanced hackers and adversaries are already leveraging repurposed or recycled malware for their own gains. I can't really comment on this first slide, but there are some leaked documents from the National Security Agency that seem to indicate that they already have these capabilities, or they are already doing this. There's also been some recent reporting, for example, in the New York Times, talking about how the Chinese government or Chinese hackers are also leveraging other agencies' exploits and malware. Now, to these well-resourced agencies that could obviously create their own malware, we might be wondering, why are they using other countries' or other groups' malware? And there's twofold. First, is just based on the risk profile. So imagine you're the NSA. You go to hack a high-value target, and once your exploit gets code execution, you see someone else is already there, perhaps another hacking group, Russians, Chinese. Really would be very unwise to put your own malware on those systems, because the other hacking group that's already there could then capture and gain access to perhaps your crown jewels. It makes way more sense to simply reconfigure or repurpose another country's malware and install that on the system, right? You still want access to that system, but you don't want to use your own tools because someone else is already there. Also then, as I mentioned, the attribution, these agencies, these advanced hacker groups really don't like the public knowing what they're doing. So again, if they can use repurposed or recycled malware, if they get detected, it'll really muddy the attribution picture. Say, okay, this looks like an American implant, but is the Chinese using it or the Russians? No one really knows. So it's very difficult to make a clear attribution. So again, for these agencies, that's very appealing. Now, of course, there are challenges to repurposing other people's malware, and we'll kind of get into exactly what these challenges are. First and foremost, though, these hackers or these groups that are repurposing malware generally don't have source code access to the malware sample that they're repurposing. So what this means is all the modifications they're doing is going to be at the binary level. So the first thing these hackers must do, once they want to repurpose a piece of malware, is to fully analyze the sample and answer questions such as, how does it persist? Does it talk to a remote command and control server? And then once they've comprehensively understood the malware, they go about patching or configuring the malware. Again, we'll get into this, but this is generally modifying some bits, some bytes in a hex editor, and this is somewhat challenging to get right. And if you get wrong, you might crash the program. And then finally, step 4, if the malware talks to a remote command and control server, you have to understand the protocol of that, and then also create your own custom command and control server. And then finally, you have to make sure that this repurposed malware specimen remains undetected, because generally hackers are repurposing known malware, which means likely there's already detection signatures, for example, in third-party antivirus products. Now, it's very important, I want to reiterate, that for hackers, they really should get these steps right and make sure they comprehensively repurpose a piece of malware before they go to deploy it. Because if they don't, bad things can happen. So here's an example. A hacker has taken a malware sample and has modified or changed the embedded addresses of the command and control server, so when they redeploy this modified piece of malware, it'll now talk to their command and control server versus the original hacker group. However, this piece of malware had some backup command and control servers also embedded into the malware. If the hacker who was trying to repurpose this malware didn't change the backup command and control servers as well, if their primary servers ever went offline, the malware would actually start beaconing back to the original hacker's infrastructure, essentially giving hacker A, or the original hacker, now access to all these new targets that hacker B has gone and infected. So again, hackers really need to make sure that when they reconfigure a piece of malware, they do it comprehensively. All right, so now let's talk about exactly how to repurpose Mac malware to show how hackers or attackers or nation states can take other groups' malware and reconfigure it to make it essentially their own. So the first step is hackers need to pick what they want to repurpose. And usually this is based on 2 criteria. The first is deciding what you want the malware to do. Right? So if you're a hacker, you have to say, okay, I know I want to repurpose a piece of Mac malware. I don't want to write it from scratch, kind of lazy. But what do I need? Do I need an interactive backdoor? Do I need a cryptocurrency miner? Do I need a piece of ransomware? Or something more complex? Secondly, attribution might be important to the hacker. They might want to say, hey, I want to look like a US intelligence agency. Or perhaps I just want to look like a cyber criminal from Eastern Europe, right? So what they can then do is they can pop online. There's various collections of publicly available Mac malware that are often sorted by the functionality they provide. So for example, here we can see a list of some Mac malware that has the different functionality. So if we want a backdoor, we might grab cold root. If we want a crypto miner, we might get a CPU miner. And again, attribution has generally been assigned to these various samples. So again, if you're interested in masquerading as another country, you can take that into account as well. Now, once you've selected the malware sample that you want to repurpose, again, if we're wearing our hacker hats, it's time to repurpose or reconfigure the sample. And as I mentioned, the first step you need to do is fully understand the malware so that you can comprehensively and effectively repurpose it. So the first thing you want to do is you want to look and understand if this malware has a remote component, right? If it talks to a command and control server, finding out where in the code it gets that information. Because obviously, you don't want the redeployed malware to talk to the hacker's original infrastructure. You want to have it talk to your own. So for example, here on the slide, we can see there's a piece of malware. And what it's doing is it's invoking the get host by name. If we analyze this in a debugger and set a breakpoint, we can see that the malware has a hard-coded embedded IP address, 89.34. Blah, blah. So what we can normally then do is we can go into that binary, find where those actual bytes are, that string, that hard-coded IP address, and simply replace that with the address of our own command and control server. This means the malware will now beacon to our infrastructure, not the hacker's original server. It's also important to understand the protocol. Again, when the malware beacons out, it's now going to be beaconing to our servers because we've modified the IP address. But we have to understand the protocol and set up a custom command and control server so we can task this. So again, this comes through analyzing the malware, watching it in a network monitor, seeing what commands it supports, so that we can create our own custom command and control server. So once we have a comprehensive understanding of the malware, we can then go and repurpose it. Generally means this is going to involve patching out various strings or embedded config information that's in the malware's binary. So here, for example, we have a piece of malware that has the embedded IP address that we saw on the previous slide. We can just open this in a hex editor, go to the offset where the address is, and change those bytes. So here, for example, I'm testing this in a virtual machine. So I changed the IP address from that 89 IP address to a 192 IP address, which is the address of my virtual machine. And then when I go and run this malware in another virtual machine, instead of connecting out to the original hacker server, it'll now talk to my computer. So I get a connection. As I mentioned, if the malware has a remote component, that is to say it expects to talk to a remote server, perhaps to exfiltrate data or to get tasking, we need to create a custom command and control server. Now, this custom command and control server doesn't have to be anything incredibly sophisticated. I usually just whip up a simple Python script. But we have to understand the commands and the protocol that the malware speaks, so when it connects to us, we can speak essentially its language. So I gave a talk at Virus Bulletin a few years ago about creating a custom command and control server with the goal of analyzing a sample. This is also a very powerful way to analyze an unknown malware. If it connects to you and you basically start giving it tasking, you can see what it does on the remote system. So that's a great way to understand also its capabilities. However, we're taking a little bit more of an offensive mindset to show how hackers can create custom command and control servers to talk to repurposed malware samples, but that talk still goes into how you build such a server. So here we can see now, once we've created this custom command and control server, when the repurposed malware connects to us, we can give it command number 2, which we figured out is the screen capture command. The malware will then take that tasking, act on it, take a screenshot, and then send it back to our server. So now let's walk through some actual examples to show exactly how adversaries or hackers can repurpose Mac malware that's already in the wild. So we're going to start with Fruitfly. I briefly talked about this yesterday. It's a fully interactive backdoor. It was developed originally over 15 years ago, but since it's written in Perl, it's still able to function. Makes for a perfect candidate for repurposing because it supports a myriad of fairly complicated capabilities. We can see, for example, it has the ability to turn on the webcam, move the mouse and the keyboard, and take screenshots. So again, from a hacker's point of view, writing a piece of malware like this is going to take a lot of work. So if someone has already done all the hard work, why not piggyback or leverage that? So Fruitfly, as I mentioned, is written in Perl, though it's fairly obfuscated. If we start analyzing the Perl script, we can see that there's logic in the Perl script that looks for command line arguments. And the command line arguments it expects is either a port or an IP port combo of a remote command and control server. This means we actually don't have to dig into the binary and modify its code. We can just pass in the address of our own command and control server. So for example, if we go persist this on a new target as a launch agent, we can now pass in the address of our command and control server, and on that infected system, the malware will now talk to our infrastructure versus the hacker's original servers. So we can trivially repurpose this backdoor to connect to our custom command and control server. However, we need to figure out a way how to deploy this malware because the malware's original installer was never uncovered. Good news for testing purposes, I had previously created one, and we can see all the installer does once you have code execution perhaps via an exploit or a social engineering attack. You can run this Python script with just a few lines of code, will persist the malware in exactly the same way as it was originally discovered. And this is important because, again, if you're a hacker repurposing or recycling other people's malware, you want it to look like the original hacker is doing all the dirty work, so if you get caught, they get all the blame. Finally, I had already written a custom command and control server for testing the malware, so we can just use that here. So here we have a demo. On the right is our custom command and control server. We're going to start it, and we're going to wait for a connection to the repurposed malware. On the left, then, we're going to run the installer for the malware. That persists. As soon as it's persisted, since we've passed in the address of our command and control server, the malware will now talk to our server. Since we understand the various commands, we can do things like tell it to execute command number 2, which is the screen capture command. This command will get sent down to the malware. The malware will take the screen capture and send it back. So this is kind of neat because now we have this incredibly powerful, fully featured Mac malware that performs to our bidding. Basically, all we had to do was write a simple installer and a custom command and control server, and now we have access to be able to utilize this very powerful piece of Mac malware. Next, again, imagine you're an evil hacker. Perhaps you want to deploy some ransomware without spending any time or effort writing your own. So here we'll walk through how a hacker could very easily repurpose KeyRanger, which is a nasty piece of ransomware that targets Mac OS. So the way hackers originally gained access to Mac systems was by infecting the popular transmission BitTorrent client of the application's official website. This means if users went to that website to download what they thought was a pristine BitTorrent client, instead they would get a Trojanized version of the client that also installed ransomware. If we analyze this malicious disk image, this package, we can see that in the application's binary, there's a file called general.rtf. Now, this appears to be a document, but if we actually look at the file type using the file command, we can see instead it's actually a mock-O executable. If we analyze this, it turns out that this general.rtf is, as I mentioned, not really a document, but rather the actual malware component, the ransomware. What it does is it sleeps for a few days, and then it connects out to a remote command and control server, and it expects that server to give it a public RSA encryption key and then decryption instructions. It's ransomware, so it uses that encryption key to start encrypting users' files and then displays the decryption instructions, basically send some bitcoins to this address if you want your files to be decrypted. So now let's talk about how to repurpose this ransomware. First, we don't want to wait for 3 days. We want to start ransoming files right away. So what we can do is we can simply nop or patch out the sleep function. So in a hex editor, we find the instructions that call into a function that essentially calls sleep for 3 days, and we basically replace that with nop. Nop is a no-op instruction, which basically says do nothing. So since we've patched out that call, the computer will never execute into that function, meaning the malware will no longer sleep for 3 days. We then modify the addresses of the embedded command and control servers because we want the ransomware now to beacon to our servers so we can give it our encryption key and our decryption instructions. So we can see on the slides these addresses are directly embedded in the binary. So again, trivially to open a hex editor and simply change these hard-coded strings to the addresses of our command and control server. For example, here, for testing purposes, we set it to 127.0.0.1, which is obviously localhost. Now we need a server, which, again, recall, has to respond to the malware with our own decryption key and the decryption instructions. This is actually very simple to do. We basically just put this expected response in a text file and serve it up via netcat. Really not that complicated. So here's a demo of the repurposed ransomware. We'll see it now connect to our command and control server, which will provide the ransomware with our public encryption key and then our decryption instructions. The malware will then, once it's beaconed out and got this information, we can see it encrypting all the files on the desktop. So again, if you're a user, this would be really rather unfortunate. And once it's done, it's going to create a README document with our decryption instructions. And we can say, it basically says, please send all your money to Patrick. Don't really do that, but obviously you could put whatever you want there. The last example we're going to talk about repurposing. is Windtail, which is a lovely backdoor that was written by a very sophisticated APT group. This is a great example because it shows how we can take even a piece of malware that was written by a sophisticated hacker group and used in cyber espionage campaigns in the Middle East and show how fairly trivially we can repurpose this to use for our own evil purposes. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this malware is its exploit vector, that is how it got onto Mac systems. So we're going to walk through exactly how that happened. In short, though, there's some legitimate functionality in macOS where once an application is downloaded, if it contains a custom URL handler, macOS will automatically register that application, which then means it can be launched from, for example, a web page. So in terms of the backdoor, it persists as a login item, and it supports capabilities such as file collection and exfiltration. Again, remember, this is a cyber espionage implant, so hacker groups or nation states that are deploying this type of malware are most interested on information that's on a system, right? They're not going to start ransoming files, but they will collect sensitive documents to gain insight into, for example, the target that they've infected. So what this binary does, this malware does, it collects files of interest, it zips them up, and then exfiltrates them all via Apple's built-in curl utility to the attacker's command and control server. Backdoor also supports the ability to download files. So once it checks in with the command and control server, it makes a request, and if the server responds in a correct manner, it will download a file to the infected system. And we can use a network monitor while we're analyzing this malware to understand exactly how that works. So we can see, for example, the malware makes two requests. It first makes a request to get the name of the file, and then a second request to get the actual contents of the file from the hacker's remote command and control server. These bytes are then saved to the file system of the infected application. The backdoor will then execute this file, and if we look more at the disassembly of the malware, we can see that once it's received the file from the hacker's remote server, it will unzip it, which means it expects a zip file, and then execute it via the NSTask API. Finally, the backdoor also has the ability to support a self-delete logic. So every time the malware starts, it connects to the hacker's remote command and control server, and if the server responds with a 1, a string 1, the malware will know this is the command to self-delete. So what it will do then, it'll uninstall itself and fully terminate, basically clean itself off the infected system. So now we have a pretty good understanding of how the malware works, right? How it gets on systems and its capabilities. We're going to talk about repurposing this so that we could use this in our own operations if we wanted. So first, let's talk about repurposing the exploit. It's pretty easy to create a page that will download an application if a user browses to it. And as I mentioned, by default, macOS, specifically Safari, will auto-extract zip archives. And as we mentioned earlier, if the zip archive creates, or rather contains an application, if that application contains a custom URL handler, macOS will automatically register that. Then what our code does, and we can see this on line 11, we then make a request to that custom URL that has just been registered by our app, by macOS, to launch the application. There will be some pop-ups, but if the user clicks allow, the malware will be persistently infected on the system. So here's a demo. I showed this yesterday while we were talking about some malware, but basically this is a page in Safari that will automatically download and launch the malware. We can see there is a pop-up saying, hey, user, are you sure you want to launch this? But unfortunately, we know that some users will just click allow. The users that click allow will now be persistently infected, and we have now just deployed this customized backdoor to fully patched Mac systems. So now let's talk about repurposing the malware. We have the ability to repurpose the exploit, so now we need to figure out how to reconfigure the malware so it will connect to our servers so we can remotely control these infected systems. So step one, we want to be able to modify the embedded command and control server, the address, so that when the malware starts, it connects to our server, not the hacker's original servers. So we look around in the binary to find where these addresses are stored. Unfortunately, they are encrypted. So those are the actual addresses. They're base64 encoded and then encrypted. This means we can't simply modify them directly. We could understand the decryption algorithm, but that gets somewhat complicated. So what instead we do is we simply add an extra library to the malware that will be loaded every time the malware starts. And then what we can do is we can hook the decryption routine. So anytime the malware calls into itself to decrypt, for example, the addresses of the command and control server, since our code is running in the context of the malware, our extra library that we added, we can intercept that and just swap out the address with our own address. So here's an example of that happening in action. We can see now the malware, when it's loaded, it's called finalpresentation.app. Our library has been loaded as well. What our library does is it swizzles out or swaps out the malware's decryption routine, hooks it. So when the malware calls into the decryption routine, for example, to decrypt the addresses of the command and control server, we can intercept that and we can return whatever string we want. So instead of allowing the malware then to call out to its own original command and control server, we provide our own. For example, ourserver.com. This now means when the malware is deployed, it will connect to our server for tasking, not the hacker's original infrastructure. Now, we still have to write a custom command and control server so that we can task this malware, which is now connecting to our servers. Mentioned the main functionality of the malware is to collect and exfiltrate files. So we add this capability to our command and control server. The files are submitted via posts requests. So all our command and control server has to do is basically write some code to accept these post requests and then save the files to disk. Here's a demo of that. We have our custom command and control server. These are the post requests that are coming in. There's some get requests as well, but the post ones are the ones that have the exfiltrated files. So what we can see on the other side of the screen is we just start saving those to the file system. So now we can basically collect all the exfiltrated files that the repurposed malware is sending to our server. We also want to extend our custom command and control server to support the download and execute. So we noted the malware makes two requests, first for the name of the file and then for the file contents to download and execute. So we can add this in a few lines of Python code. Again, we're going to watch this in action. We're going to see when the malware is launched. It's going to connect to our server, say, hey, is there anything you want me to do? We'll say, yes, please download and execute calculator.app. This is actually a very powerful capability because it allows us to extend the malware in any way we want. If we want to install another tool or perhaps another malware sample, we can use this download and execute capability of the initial sample that we've deployed to install other tools or any other capabilities that we want. Finally, we can make our custom command and control server support the self-delete. This is also a very nice capability to be able to remove yourself off infected systems. Imagine you get a knock on the door one day from the FBI coming after you. It'd be really great to press a button and just have all your infected systems clean up, and then there's no proof left that you did anything wrong. Very easy to add this to our server. Recall that the malware, when it connects out, looks for a response, the string 1. So in our command and control server, if we give it back this string 1, the malware will delete itself and fully terminate. So we're going to show this in a demo. Note the malware installs itself into the user's library directory. Kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, but the average user is not going to be poking around in this directory anyways. We're going to see the malware connect out to our custom command and control server, eventually. And then we give it the self-delete request. The malware processes that, deletes, and then exits, which obviously means it's going to stop beaconing to us as well. So in that part of the presentation, we showed exactly how to repurpose a myriad of Mac malware. We talked about backdoors, ransomware, and even fully featured APT-type implants. However, now, we kind of need to talk about how this malware can also sidestep some of the built-in Mac detection and malware mitigations and also third-party AV detections. Because most of this malware that hackers are going to be repurposing, as I mentioned, is going to be known malware, which means there's already detection signatures for it. So let's talk first about some of Apple's built-in malware mitigations. If you were in my talk yesterday, we covered some of these. We're briefly going to jam through these as well. Again, these are built-in security mechanisms in macOS that are largely designed to protect against malware attacks. And we'll see that while they're somewhat sufficient, they're also, unfortunately, pretty easy to sidestep. So we're going to talk about things like xprotect, revoked cert checks, and the MRT, or the malware removal tool. So first up, we have xprotect. XProtect is a signature-based AV scanner that's built into recent versions of macOS. And what it does is when the user downloads a file from the internet and launches it, XProtect will intercept that application launch and scan that binary or that application. It has a list of signatures that Apple updates every now and again that are in a file named xprotect.yara. If we look at that file, we can see signatures for the malware that Apple is looking for. And we can see, for example, there is one for KeyRanger, which recall is the piece of ransomware that we repurposed. Since XProtect, though, is a purely signature-based scheme, it's pretty easy to bypass, as are any signature-based schemes. So if we take a closer look at the KeyRanger signature that's embedded in the XProtect signature file, we can see it maps to a certain number of instructions. So we have the actual bytes of the signature, and then this is the malicious application. And in a disassembler, we can see those bytes in the signature map to those instructions. What this means is we can trivially either reorder these instructions or modify them, which means the signature will no longer match, meaning Mac will no longer detect this as malware. So for example, what we do is we change a constant from 400 hex to 300 hex. This won't change the functionality of the malware at all, but this 1 byte change will make XProtect no longer detect the malware. So we have a demo of this. On the left is the original sample. On the right is our repurposed variant with this 1 byte change. We're going to see if the user launches the original sample, macOS says, hey, I'm not going to run this because it's infected with KeyRanger. However, the original, the modified sample, when executed, there'll still be the pop-up saying, hey, this is from the internet, standard quarantine pop-up, but there is no option to block it because we've basically just bypassed the XProtect signature with this 1 byte modification. And again, if the user clicks allow, the ransomware will be persistently executing on the system and start to infect the user file. Now on to code signing check. Recent versions of macOS enforce code signing check. Again, this is another good idea from a security point of view. A lot of malware, though, is signed as well because Gatekeeper by default does not block signed binaries. A downside from the hacker's point of view is once Apple or the AV community has detected something as a piece of malware, if it's signed, Apple can quickly revoke the certificate, which then means if that malware tries to infect other systems, macOS will actually block it. Because one check that Apple does, macOS does, is every time an application is launched, it checks to make sure that the certificate is still valid. So obviously, if Apple has revoked their certificate, because it's a signed piece of now known malware, the malware will be blocked. And we can see this happening, for example, with Windtail. If we try to launch Windtail, macOS will basically say, hey, no, this certificate has been revoked. I'm not going to allow you to run this. Of course, hackers don't want their repurposed samples to be blocked, so let's talk about how you can kind of get around this. Make the observation that in this scenario, the system is not blocking the malware, it's just blocking the revoked certificate. So all the hackers have to do is remove the revoked certificate and then either distribute the malware unsigned or re-sign it with a stolen or fraudulently obtained developer ID, which is not that hard to get. So we can actually use an Apple utility to do that. The code sign utility has an undocumented remove signature flag. If you execute that, that will remove the certificate, the revoked certificate from the sample. Then if you have another code signing ID, you can attach it to that sample with the codesign.s. This means now that sample will be validly signed and be allowed to run. Finally, we have MRT. This is another Apple-created AV-like tool that's built into recent versions of macOS. It's somewhat similar to XProtect, but it scans for malware that may already be on the system and removes any samples that it finds. Unlike XProtect, its signatures are directly embedded into its binary. And an interesting note, Apple also occasionally uses the MRT binary to remove software from Mac systems without user interaction if Apple deems that software to be unsafe or unworthy. So kind of interesting feature that's built into macOS. MRT, like XProtect, is a signature-based mechanism. And as I stated earlier, any signature-based mechanism is pretty easy to sidestep. So we can dump the MRT binary because recall the signatures that MRT is looking for are embedded directly in the binary file. So if we run, for example, the string command or look at it in a disassembler, we can see there are various strings. For example, a signature for fruit fly. If we look, though, at the signature, we can see that the signature is detecting fruit fly based on its name and path. This means all the hacker has to do is either rename the malware or rename the persistence path. It's very easy to do. And then MRT will no longer detect and remove this malware. Finally, with the release of Catalina, Apple has added some extra security mechanisms such as code notarization. And when I was originally doing this research, I thought, OK, this could actually be very problematic for the hackers and for the malware, which is a good thing, because what notarization requires is that hackers, developers, anyone who's creating software for macOS now has to submit their software to Apple first before they can deploy it. This gives Apple the ability to scan the system, or rather scan the application, to detect if it's malicious. I had this funny conversation with, I guess, a hacker who was kind of asking me about this code notarization and basically saying, hey, I wrote some malware. I submitted it to Apple because I needed it to get notarized, which I think is hilarious. And Apple, again, detected that this was malware, and so revoked all of his certificate. And as we can see at the bottom, the hacker is bemoaning this fact, basically saying, this ruined my entire operation. So again, this is a very powerful new feature that, in theory, gives Apple the ability to examine these binaries before they're distributed. So even if we are repurposing this malware, in theory, Apple can examine this. If you were at my talk yesterday, though, I talked briefly, not how, but alluded to the fact that we've already discovered some weaknesses. We've reported these to Apple, but currently there's still opportunities for hackers to run software on Catalina, even if it's not been notarized. That has come from the internet. But hopefully that attack vector will be shut down shortly, so I think this security mechanism will really have an impact on the ability for hackers to distribute malware, either new samples or repurposed samples. So kudos to Apple. All right, I briefly want to mention bypassing third-party security products because these are becoming more and more common on Mac systems. We're going to focus on antivirus products. Now, this has been talked about before a lot, and this is kind of a well-known fact. Most antivirus products, especially on Mac OS, are signature-based. It's kind of interesting if you talk to a company that has a Windows component and a Mac component of a software product. Their Windows software is usually very mature, very sophisticated. But a lot of times, their Mac product is just not as evolved and is largely signature-based. This is problematic because if we modify any of the samples, they're going to change, meaning the signatures, just like as was the case with XProtect, will no longer detect. Trivial example, took fruit fly. It's a very well-known piece of malware that the majority of AV companies have signatures for. I ran it through an online Perl obfuscator, free, second hit on Google, re-uploaded it to VirusTotal, and none of the AV engines on VirusTotal detected this new sample, even though it was exactly the same. There's also more advanced techniques you can utilize if you are creating or repurposing malware to bypass the signature-based approach. You can pack it, you can encrypt it, you can execute it in memory. I gave a talk at Black Hat a few years ago, so if you're interested in those techniques, you can check out that presentation. So let's end by talking about protection, because as Mac users, this all kind of, sucks. So we showed that advanced adversaries are already repurposing sophisticated samples. And as we showed in the slides, it's really not that difficult for hackers to do, right? If you understand disassembly and you have access to a hex editor, you can take these very sophisticated malware samples, tweak a few bytes, and then you have this very powerful capability that you can use to infect other systems. We also showed, unfortunately, the majority of detection systems, both built into macOS and third-party AV products, may fail to detect these repurpose threats. In my opinion, this is rather lame, less than ideal, because if you think about it, these repurpose samples are essentially identical to the original ones in terms of their functionality. For example, yes, we repurposed a piece of ransomware, but it still encrypts all the user's files, right? Its behavior is identical to the original sample. That is to say, we're really not changing them that much. So in my opinion, it's rather unfortunate that the security products are unable to detect these threats, but that's largely because they're looking at signatures, not behaviors. So I kind of just talked about this, but it's well known that detecting malware based on signatures, while it has its benefits, right? Not going to have any false positives, but it's going to be unable to detect repurposed or new malware threats. So instead, what we must do to ensure that our Macs remain secure is look for malicious behaviors, because malware, by definition, does odd or malicious things. And again, just to reiterate, even when a hacker repurposes a piece of malware, it's still going to do those same malicious behaviors or activities. So some of the things we can look for, these malicious ideas, are things like persistence, perhaps accessing the web or the mic when the user is not active on the computer, taking screenshots from a background process, generating synthetic clicks, capturing keystrokes, or perhaps encrypting and exfiltrating files. These actions are things that legitimate software normally does not do. So if we simply key off these behaviors, we can likely detect both new and repurposed malware samples. So let's start with persistence. The majority of Mac malware is going to persist. So very easily what we can do is we can simply monitor the file system and look for persistence attempts. So here, for example, Wintail, which persists as a login item, since we are watching for new login items, as soon as it installs itself on the system, we get an alert, regardless if it's been repurposed or not, because it's still going to be persisting as a login item. Next up, we can also, as I mentioned, monitor mic and webcam access. This is a really good thing to look for because a lot of Mac malware is going to try to surreptitiously turn on the webcam or the mic to spy on Mac users. And I've listed some examples of Mac malware that does that. So what we can do is we can register a notification with the OS that says, hey, please let me know anytime a program turns on the mic or the webcam. Now, obviously, there are going to be legitimate examples of this, right? You use FaceTime or WebEx or something. It's going to use the webcam and the mic. However, we can see what process turned on the webcam, and we can combine this with other detections to say, oh, this is an unsigned daemon that's running in the background. The user didn't explicitly turn on the webcam. Why is the webcam or mic still on? And then we can generate an alert, because that's likely suspicious. We can also detect when keyloggers are detected, because malware will often try to install a keylogger so that it can capture key presses, passwords, credit card numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So the most common way on Mac OS to install a keylogger is to use something called an event tap. Luckily, the operating system will broadcast the notification anytime a new event tap has been added. So we simply register for that notification, and then anytime malware installs a keylogger, if it's an event tap-based one, we will get a notification. And again, then we can examine that and generate an alert. Malware such as Fruitfly has the ability to synthetically interact with the UI. So it can programmatically send mouse clicks to security prompts and other parts of the UI. This is a very powerful capability, but this is something we want to detect because, again, very rare that legitimate software is moving the mouse and generating programmatic mouse clicks. So what we can do is we can monitor for mouse activity, and then we can examine the mouse click object, and it will be set to 0 or 1 based on the fact it was user-generated or programmatically generated. So based on this, then, we can generically detect synthetic clicks. So even if someone has repurposed Fruitfly, since it has the ability to generate these clicks, that's not going to be repurposed, right? We can detect when Fruitfly performs those malicious actions. So let's end by talking about how we can do this in an enterprise security product. We've talked a lot about Jamf Protect this week, so I'm not going to get into it too much. But suffice to say, we are monitoring the system for a whole bunch of activities, mic and webcam access, persistence, key logging activity, synthetic clicks. We feed all that data into Apple's game logic engine. And on top of that, we have written detection rules. These also gets fed into the game logic engine. And then the game logic engine will apply our predicates or our rules on top of all our data and very efficiently and quickly detect if there's any anomalies on the system. Basically, evaluate our rule. So we can now detect some of these repurposed malware threats fairly easily. So for example, we talked about Wintail. It abuses custom URL handlers as a way to infect even fully patched Mac systems. So what we can do, though, is we can write a rule or an analytic to generically detect this. So we can say, OK, let's detect the fact that Safari has auto-opened an application or a zip file. We can then detect in step 2 that that application, which was just unzipped by Safari, contains a custom URL handler that macOS just automatically registered. And then in 3, we can see that application that was downloaded, registered a URL handler, was also then automatically executed with, from a web page, basically launching the attack. So cumulatively, once we observe all 3 of these actions, we can generate an alert basically saying, hey, just to let you know, something automatically was launched on the system, this is probably something you want to take a closer look at. Similarly, we can also detect a sample of malware, such as fruit fly, even if it's been repurposed, by observing various events that cumulatively indicate something suspicious is happening. So here we observe the fact that a hidden non-Apple binary has persisted, a launch item. There is no legitimate software that's going to do this, right? So as soon as we see a launch item has been created that's not signed by Apple, that is executing a hidden binary, we will alert and key on that fact right away. Now imagine fruit fly has already been installed. We can also detect it, even if it's been repurposed, by looking for other runtime behaviors. For example, fruit fly does things like running a hidden process, that's suspicious, dropping an embedded unsigned binary to the temp directory, that's potentially suspicious, and then doing things like generating synthetic events, clearly malicious. So what we can do is we can cumulatively observe all these events and trigger when all of them trigger, or perhaps we want to log a message when we see one or two of these, because some of them might be malicious enough that or unusual enough that if we see them individually, you want to take a closer look at the system. So that's kind of a wrap. So today we talked about how hackers can and are repurposing Mac malware. The benefit of this approach is it allows other hacker groups to work smart, not hard, and also it muddles the attribution picture. Nation states are doing this, and it's actually not that difficult to do, so I would be unsurprised if other hacker groups don't start doing this more. We also showed that if we are leveraging solely signature-based approaches, it's very easy for hackers to sidestep that. So I really believe it's a better approach to focus on detecting the malicious behaviors, because using a system like that, you will be able to detect existing malware, repurpose malware, and new malware if it's using similar techniques. So again, that's a wrap. Thank you so much for attending my talk. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Yes?
Do you detect swizzling? Is that a behavior you're going to handle?
That is a great question. So swizzling, the question is, can we detect swizzling? Swizzling is basically the technique I described earlier where you can swap out at runtime functions. And this is a very powerful technique that malware occasionally uses to kind of redirect code execution. Unfortunately, currently that's not something that is detected, largely because that's something you have to detect in memory. And currently, Apple does not provide an API for even trusted security tools to examine the memory of other processes from user mode. If you had this technique, if you had the ability to examine memory, it would be fairly trivial because you could just diff the in-memory image versus the on-disk image and then detect that there has been some modifications that are occurring in memory. It's something I'm going to ask Apple for this capability. I understand they don't want random processes poking around in other memory spaces, but I think an entitled security tool, it would be a very powerful technique for you to basically scan memory. This is something that security tools can do on Windows, and it allows you to detect very sophisticated malware. So Apple, I'm gonna beg you for this capability. Great question. Any others? Yes, in the back. Oh, and then we'll get to you. Sure. Yeah. Yeah. Great question. So the question was, okay, we talked about all this repurposed malware. How does it actually get on the end user systems? Because obviously that's a prerequisite for you to be able to deploy repurposed malware. You need to be able to get the code on the system. The most common techniques are still software engineering or social engineering based approaches. The fake flash updater, hey, please run this application that I'm emailing it to you, et cetera, et cetera. We did show, though, that Wintail kind of had a slicker remote detection capability. And as I talked about yesterday, there's a public 0-day floating around that basically if a user opens an Excel document and the attacker has a sandbox escape, they can bypass and automatically install malware simply by a user opening an Excel document. So luckily, most attacks require some sort of user interaction, but there are more sophisticated ones out there that leverage 0 days to infect fully patched Mac systems with no user interaction. But luckily, those aren't that common. Yes?
Great presentation yesterday and a wonderful addition today. Question is, how often is XProtect signature database and MRT tools binary being updated by Apple?
Great question.
not until the new OS comes out, but in between
Sure.
the OS. And also, will Jamf Protect be sharing the identification of the malware it detects and add it to the built-in tool so that they can be stopped because you guys detected something?
Yeah, so great question. I'll answer this and wrap it up because I think we're almost out of time. XProtect, though, as we mentioned, is one of Apple's built-in AV signature-based detection mechanisms. They update it occasionally, but very rarely. It's funny because I think they updated yesterday, but before that, it had been a long time. The other problem is, and I've kind of voiced my opinion on this matter, this is a personal opinion, but when Apple pushes out an XProtect update, one, they don't make that known, right? It's only determined by us monitoring that file or another security researcher noting that the version number has changed. More problematic, the signatures that Apple puts in are not publicly described. And we've seen cases where Apple has updated a signature. We have no idea what it's detecting, and neither do other people in the AV industry, at least the ones I talk to, who have insight into this process, which means Apple is not necessarily sharing, in my opinion, as much information as we could. This segues into the second part of your question is, if we detect something, or me personally, I'm a huge fan of not only discussing and sharing the signature, but also writing about how that malware works and sharing a sample, because I personally believe it's very important to share this information, so especially other companies or other people who are writing other security tools are equally able to provide protection. I don't think that just because you're running my tool, you should be protected. Like, if you're running another tool, you should also have that signature access. Now, I understand Apple pushes out this information, and in theory, this is already running on all Macs, and that's protected. But as we showed, it's very easy to bypass some of their signatures, so it'd be great if more information would be shared. So I'm going to request two things from Apple: the ability to scan the memory of other processes, and more threat sharing, because we're all in this together. So again, this is my personal opinion, but excellent questions. All right, so I think we're out of time. I'll be here or around, so if you want to talk nerdy about Mac malware and all these things, I would be super stoked to chat more. So thank you again. I really appreciate you attending my talk.